Captain Marcus Kane adjusted his dress uniform for the fourth time in 10 minutes, trying to project the calm professionalism expected of a diplomatic attaché while privately wondering if anyone had bothered to mention that vampire coronation ceremonies involved quite this much ritual bloodletting. The grand throne room of the starship Crimson Eternum stretched before him like a cathedral designed by someone with a serious Gothic architecture obsession and unlimited access to decorative skulls. Magnificent, isn't it? Ambassador Collins whispered beside him, apparently immune to the theatrical excess surrounding them. 3,000 years of vampire tradition, and they still know how to put on a show. Marcus nodded diplomatically while mentally cataloging the various ways this diplomatic mission could go catastrophically wrong. The Nosferatu Empire's decision to finally engage in formal relations with the Human Federation represented either a historic breakthrough or an elaborate trap, and given vampire history, the odds were roughly even. The ceremony began with a procession of vampire nobles that looked like a fashion show for elegant predators. Each courtier moved with fluid grace that made ordinary human movement seem clumsy by comparison, their pale skin luminous under the chamber's crimson lighting. Ancient ritual music filled the air, haunting melodies that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones and make his pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. Then she entered, and every other thought abandoned Marcus's mind completely. Queen Seraphina Nyx moved through the assembled court like liquid starlight given form, her presence commanding attention without effort. Centuries of immortal existence had refined her beauty into something that transcended mere physical attraction. She was terrible and magnificent, alien and achingly familiar, dangerous and somehow, lonely. Her coronation gown shifted between deep crimson and midnight black as she walked, the fabric seeming to absorb and reflect light according to its own mysterious principles. Ancient silver circlets adorned her elongated ears, while her dark hair fell in waves that framed features too perfect to be entirely human. But it was her eyes that captured Marcus completely, deep crimson that held depths of memory and experience no mortal being could comprehend. "Breathe, Captain," Dr. Sarah Kim murmured from his other side, her voice carrying the amused tone of someone who'd been studying xenobiology long enough to recognize instant attraction when she saw it. "Remember, diplomatic immunity doesn't extend to public swooning." Marcus forced himself to focus on the ceremony's formal progression, though his attention kept drifting back to the vampire queen. Ancient rituals unfolded with choreographed precision, the presentation of ceremonial goblets filled with what he hoped was symbolic rather than literal blood, the recitation of oaths in a language that predated human civilization, the moment when starlight from the chamber's massive viewport seemed to bend and focus on the ascending ruler. By blood and starlight, by ancient covenant and eternal bond, Queen Seraphina spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that made the words resonate in ways human vocal cords couldn't achieve. "I accept the crown of shadows and the responsibility of guiding our people through the darkness between stars." The formal language was impressive, but Marcus found himself more captivated by the way she carried herself, regal without arrogance, powerful without cruelty, isolated by necessity rather than choice. He'd read the briefings about vampire society, understood the political necessity of this alliance, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of watching a being who'd lived through the rise and fall of civilizations accept the burden of leadership. As the ceremony reached its climax, with ancient vampire lords kneeling before their new queen, Marcus felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. Perhaps it was the romance of the moment, the otherworldly beauty of the proceedings, or simply the way starlight caught in Queen Seraphina's crimson eyes, but he found himself imagining impossible scenarios. "Will you marry me?" he whispered under his breath, the words meant as dark humor about the absurdity of interspecies attraction and the kind of complications that would make Ambassador Collins require emergency sedation. The words had barely left his lips when Queen Seraphina's head turned with predatory grace, her enhanced hearing catching what he'd intended as a private moment of satirical commentary. Her crimson eyes met his across the ceremonial distance, and Marcus felt his heart stop as he realized that vampire senses were considerably more acute than human ones. The newly crowned queen studied his face with an intensity that made him feel as though she were reading his soul, examining every thought and motivation with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats and opportunities across centuries of existence. The entire court seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was occurring though they couldn't quite identify what. "Yes," Queen Seraphina said clearly, her voice carrying across the throne room with perfect clarity. The single word held no hesitation, no qualification, no hint that she considered this anything other than a formal proposal requiring immediate response. The court erupted into gasps, whispers, and what sounded like several diplomatic heart attacks occurring simultaneously. Ambassador Collins made a strangled sound that suggested his carefully planned diplomatic objectives had just been obliterated by an accidental marriage proposal. Dr. Kim grabbed Marcus's arm with enough force to leave bruises, her expression cycling between scientific fascination and sheer horror. Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. His whispered joke had been heard, interpreted as genuine, and accepted by one of the most powerful beings in known space. The political ramifications alone were staggering, but more immediate was his growing realization that some part of him, some deep, irrational part he tried to ignore, had meant those words more seriously than he cared to admit. Queen Seraphina continued to watch him with those impossibly ancient eyes, and Marcus thought he detected something that might have been amusement flickering in their crimson depths. Or hunger. With vampires, the distinction was often academic. That is. Marcus began, then stopped as he realized that anything he said now would be heard by the entire assembled court and recorded for posterity. Diplomatic training hadn't covered accidentally proposing marriage to immortal rulers, though he suspected it would be added to the curriculum after this incident. "The ancient laws are clear," announced Lord Bartholomew, the vampire court's eldest advisor, his voice carrying the weight of millennia and what sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. "A proposal made during coronation ceremony, witnessed by the assembled court, and accepted by the crown, constitutes a formal engagement according to the old covenants." "The old covenants?" Ambassador Collins repeated weakly, his face taking on the pallor of someone realizing his career had just become significantly more complicated. "Indeed," Lord Bartholomew continued with obvious relish. "Such bonds are considered matters of destiny rather than mere political arrangement. The stars themselves have witnessed this exchange." Marcus looked at Queen Seraphina, who had moved closer during the advisor's pronouncement. Up close, her otherworldly beauty was even more overwhelming, but it was the intelligence in her eyes that truly captured his attention, ancient wisdom tempered by something that might have been hope. "Captain Kane," she said softly, her voice for his ears alone despite the assembled crowd. "It seems the universe has a sense of humor about mortal plans. The question now is whether you're prepared to discover what destiny has in mind for us both." As the implications of his whispered words settled over the throne room like cosmic irony made manifest, Marcus realized that his quiet joke had just changed the course of interspecies relations forever. And despite the diplomatic chaos erupting around him, he found himself surprisingly curious about what came next. The diplomatic quarters aboard the Crimson Eternum had apparently been designed by someone who believed that comfort was a sign of weakness and that proper ambience required at least 3 different types of ornamental weaponry per room. Marcus sat in what passed for a comfortable chair, trying to process the previous day's events while Ambassador Collins paced nearby with the manic energy of someone whose carefully planned career had just been derailed by cosmic comedy. "Let me understand this correctly," Collins said, consulting his tablet for the 7th time in 10 minutes. "According to ancient vampire law, your accidental proposal during a coronation ceremony constitutes a binding engagement that can only be dissolved by mutual consent or ritual combat to the death." "That's accurate," Marcus confirmed, though he was having difficulty focusing on the political implications when he kept remembering the way Queen Seraphina's eyes had seemed to see directly into his soul. Though Lord Bartholomew mentioned something about a compatibility assessment period, that sounds less immediately fatal. Dr. Kim looked up from her research terminal, her expression bright with the enthusiasm of someone who discovered a fascinating new area of study. "This is incredible. The biological implications alone, vampire physiology interacting with human genetics, the potential for hybrid vigor, the evolutionary significance of interspecies bonding protocols." "Sarah," Collins said weakly, "this is a diplomatic crisis, not a research opportunity. Why can't it be both?" Dr. Kim replied cheerfully. Besides, according to these records, there hasn't been a human-vampire royal engagement in over 2,000 years. The last one apparently ended when the human died of old age after 30 years of marriage, which the vampire considered heartbreakingly brief but profoundly meaningful. Marcus absorbed this information with the growing suspicion that his life had taken a turn toward the surreal that would be difficult to explain to future historians. What exactly does this compatibility assessment involve? His question was answered by the arrival of Lady Crimson, Queen Seraphina's personal advisor, who entered with the fluid grace typical of vampire nobility and the expression of someone who found the entire situation enormously entertaining. "Captain Kane," she said, her accent carrying the musical quality of someone who'd learned multiple languages across centuries of existence. "Her Majesty requests your presence for the traditional courtship protocols. I trust you're prepared for instruction in proper vampire etiquette." "Define proper," Marcus said cautiously. Lady Crimson's smile revealed fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. "Nothing too daunting. Basic neck presentation, appropriate blood-sharing ceremonies, the correct posture for formal feeding positions, standard courtship behavior, really." Collins made a sound that suggested he was experiencing a minor diplomatic aneurysm. "Feeding positions? Ceremonial only," Lady Crimson assured him with obvious amusement. "Though I should mention that vampire marriages traditionally involve the exchange of blood rather than rings. Much more romantic, really, jewelry can be lost, but shared essence creates bonds that transcend mortality." Dr. Kim's eyes lit up with scientific curiosity. "Fascinating. The biochemical implications of vampiric blood exchange, the potential for genetic modification, enhanced healing factors, extended lifespan." "Extended lifespan?" Marcus interrupted, feeling as though the conversation was moving beyond his comfort zone at relativistic speeds. "Oh yes," Lady Crimson said casually. "Royal consorts typically undergo partial transformation to ensure compatibility with immortal partners. Can't have the marriage ending due to inconvenient mortality after just a few decades." The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. Marcus found himself contemplating the difference between compatibility assessment and species reassignment surgery, while wondering if his accidental proposal had just committed him to becoming something other than human. "Of course," Lady Crimson continued with diplomatic smoothness, "such transformations require mutual consent and careful preparation. Her Majesty would never force such changes upon an unwilling partner. She's quite progressive about consent issues." "Progressive vampires," Collins muttered, apparently reaching the limits of his diplomatic training. "This mission just keeps getting better." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Queen Seraphina herself, who entered with the kind of presence that made the room's atmospheric processors seem inadequate. She wore a flowing gown of deep purple that complemented her pale skin, and her crimson eyes held depths that made Marcus feel as though she could see through his careful diplomatic facade to whatever truth lay beneath. "Captain Kane," she said, her voice carrying warmth that seemed at odds with her fearsome reputation. "I trust Lady Crimson has explained the traditional protocols. I should mention that I find most of them rather antiquated, but the court does enjoy its ceremonies." "Your Majesty," Marcus said, rising to his feet with what he hoped was appropriate respect. "I have to admit, yesterday's events were unexpected." Queen Seraphina's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy. "I imagine so. Though I confess, your proposal was the most interesting thing to happen during a coronation ceremony in several centuries. Usually they're dreadfully formal affairs with predictable political posturing." "About that," Marcus said carefully, "I should clarify that my words were meant as a joke," the Queen finished gently. "Yes, I gathered that from your tone and facial expression. Vampire hearing is quite acute, and we become rather skilled at reading subtle emotional cues over the centuries." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Then why did you accept?" Queen Seraphina was quiet for a moment, her ancient eyes studying his face with careful attention. "Because," she said finally, in 800 years of existence, very few beings have looked at me and seen anything other than a useful ally or a dangerous threat. Your whispered proposal, joke though it was, carried an undertone of genuine attraction that I found refreshing. 800 years. Dar. Kim interjected with scientific fascination. The cellular regeneration implications alone. Sarah, Collins warned, though his tone suggested he was fighting a losing battle against the evening's surreal momentum. Queen Seraphina smiled at Dr. Kim's enthusiasm. I quite like your scientist, Captain. Curiosity is a quality I value highly. 837 years, actually, though after the first few centuries, one tends to stop counting quite so precisely. Marcus found himself studying the vampire queen's face, searching for signs of the immense age she carried. Her features appeared no older than 30 in human terms, but her eyes held depths of experience that spoke to centuries of observation and adaptation. What exactly are you proposing? Marcus asked, then winced at his choice of words. I mean, what would this compatibility assessment involve? Time, Queen Seraphina said simply. Conversation. The opportunity to determine whether this accidental engagement might become something more meaningful than cosmic comedy. I've been alone for a very long time, Captain Kane. The prospect of genuine companionship, even with a being whose lifespan is measured in decades rather than centuries, holds considerable appeal. The honesty in her voice surprised Marcus, revealing vulnerability beneath the regal composure. He found himself responding to that vulnerability with an instinctive desire to offer comfort, despite the vast differences in their species and experience. And if we discover we're incompatible, he asked. Then we dissolve the engagement with appropriate ceremony and diplomatic grace, Queen Seraphina replied. Though I suspect you'll find vampire society more interesting than your briefing suggested. We're not quite the monsters your legends describe. Lady Crimson cleared her throat diplomatically. Speaking of ceremonies, Your Majesty, the court is eager to begin the traditional engagement celebrations. Lord Bartholomew has already begun planning the Blood Moon Festival. Blood Moon Festival? Collins repeated weakly. Nothing ominous, Queen Seraphina assured him with obvious amusement. Though I should warn you, Captain, that vampire celebrations tend toward the theatrical. We've had considerable time to develop elaborate party planning skills. As the evening progressed with discussions of ancient protocols and modern adaptations, Marcus found himself increasingly intrigued by the complexity of the being he'd accidentally proposed to. Queen Seraphina combined regal authority with unexpected humor, ancient wisdom with genuine curiosity about human culture, and beneath it all, a loneliness that resonated with his own carefully hidden emotional isolation. Perhaps, he thought as Lady Crimson explained the finer points of formal vampire dining etiquette, cosmic comedy might occasionally produce results more profound than anyone anticipated. 3 weeks into what Marcus had begun thinking of as the most elaborate first date in galactic history, he found himself in Queen Seraphina's private study, surrounded by books that predated human civilization and trying to understand how someone could remember the fall of empires as personal experiences rather than historical footnotes. The Andromedan Confederation, Queen Seraphina said, gesturing to a crystalline data archive that pulsed with soft light, collapsed because they couldn't adapt their rigid social structures to accommodate new species. I was there for the final council session, quite dramatic, really. The Emperor threw his crown at the ambassador from Rigel and declared the entire concept of democracy an affront to natural order. Marcus found himself laughing despite the historical magnitude of what she was describing. You speak about galactic politics like I talk about college roommates. Time provides perspective, she replied with a smile that revealed just the tips of her fangs. Though I admit, watching civilizations rise and fall does give one a rather cynical view of political promises. Your human federation, however, has shown remarkable longevity for such a young species. They sat in comfortable chairs positioned near a massive viewport that offered a view of the nebula where the vampire fleet had anchored for these extended diplomatic discussions. The sight was breathtaking, clouds of cosmic dust painted in impossible colors by the radiation of newborn stars, but Marcus found his attention consistently drawn to his companion instead of the celestial display. Over the past weeks, he'd discovered that Queen Seraphina defied every preconception he'd held about vampire royalty. She was brilliant without being condescending, powerful without being cruel, and possessed a sense of humor that ran toward the darkly philosophical. More surprisingly, she seemed genuinely interested in his perspectives on subjects she'd been observing for centuries. "Tell me about mortality," she said suddenly, her crimson eyes focusing on his face with the intensity that had initially unnerved him but now felt like genuine attention rather than predatory assessment. "What's it like knowing that your time is limited?" Marcus considered the question seriously, recognizing it as more than casual curiosity. "It makes everything more precious, I suppose. When you know you only have a certain number of years, every experience carries weight. But it also means accepting that you'll never see how certain stories end. And that doesn't terrify you?" "Sometimes," Marcus admitted. "But the alternative, watching everyone you care about age and die while you remain unchanged, that seems like its own kind of terror." Queen Seraphina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant in a way that suggested she was accessing memories spanning centuries. "I've buried 17 civilizations worth of friends," she said softly. "Each time, I told myself it was worth it for the time we shared. But the accumulation of loss, it changes you. Makes you cautious about forming new connections." The vulnerability in her voice struck Marcus unexpectedly. In their weeks of conversation, she'd revealed glimpses of the loneliness that came with immortality, but this was the first time she'd acknowledged the emotional cost so directly. "Is that why you accepted my accidental proposal?" he asked gently. "Because you thought it might be easier to love someone whose death you could predict?" Queen Seraphina turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I accepted because in 8 centuries of existence, you're the first being who looked at me and saw someone worth loving rather than something worth using. Your mortality is both the most precious and most painful aspect of any relationship we might build." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Kim's voice crackling through the communication system. "Marcus, we need you in the medical bay. We've discovered something significant about your blood work." Marcus and Queen Seraphina exchanged glances. The medical examinations had been part of the compatibility assessment, standard protocols to ensure that any potential bonding wouldn't result in biological incompatibility or catastrophic immune responses. They found Dr. Kim in the medical bay, surrounded by holographic displays showing complex genetic sequences and looking like someone who just discovered the scientific equivalent of buried treasure. "This is extraordinary," she announced without preamble. "Marcus, your genetic profile contains dormant sequences that shouldn't exist in baseline human DNA. Specifically, markers that suggest vampire ancestry from approximately 15 generations ago." "Vampire ancestry?" Marcus repeated, feeling as though the universe was revealing new layers of cosmic comedy. "That's impossible. My family tree is thoroughly documented back to Earth's colonial period." "Not impossible, just previously undetected," Dr. Kim corrected excitedly. "These sequences are incredibly subtle, they wouldn't show up in standard genetic screening. But when exposed to vampire pheromones and energy signatures..." She gestured to a display showing DNA segments beginning to activate. "They're beginning to express themselves." Queen Seraphina moved closer to examine the data, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching wonder. "Lord Bartholomew theorized this might be possible," she murmured. "He claimed that the ancient bloodlines occasionally resurface in unexpected ways, but I assumed it was wishful thinking from someone who'd lived too long and seen too many patterns." "What does this mean?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "It means," Dr. Kim said with scientific enthusiasm, "that your accidental proposal might have been guided by biological recognition on a level below conscious awareness. Your dormant vampire genetics were responding to Queen Seraphina's presence, creating attraction patterns that felt like random chemistry but were actually genetic destiny expressing itself." "Destiny," Marcus repeated flatly. "My love life is being dictated by dormant DNA. Queen Seraphina's expression softened into amusement. I prefer to think of it as the universe having a sense of humor about cosmic timing. Though it does explain why our conversations have felt so natural. Their discussion was interrupted by alarms beginning to blare throughout the ship. Emergency lighting bathed the medical bay in red warning signals as Captain Torres's voice echoed through the communication system, all hands to battle stations. We're detecting incoming vessels, configuration suggests hostile intent. Queen Seraphina's demeanor shifted instantly from contemplative partner to commanding ruler. The purest faction, she said grimly. They've opposed any alliance with humans from the beginning. It seems they've decided to resolve the matter through direct action. Marcus felt his military training engage automatically. What kind of opposition are we facing? Vampire traditionalists with ancient ships and older grudges, Queen Seraphina replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded fleets across multiple star systems. They view our engagement as an abomination that threatens vampire racial purity. Through the medical bay's viewport, Marcus could see sleek ships emerging from hyperspace, vessels with the predatory lines typical of vampire design but radiating the hostile energy of beings committed to violence. The lead ship was already broadcasting demands for Queen Seraphina's surrender and his immediate execution. Well, Marcus said, checking his sidearm with practiced efficiency, I suppose this answers the question about whether our relationship will face external opposition. Queen Seraphina smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, Marcus saw the predator that legends warned about. Captain Kane, she said with deadly grace, I believe it's time you saw what vampire royalty looks like when protecting something precious. As the ship prepared for battle and Marcus found himself facing the reality that loving an immortal queen meant sharing her enemies, he realized that destiny, genetic or otherwise, rarely offered simple solutions. But watching Queen Seraphina transform from contemplative companion to fearsome warrior, he discovered that some complications were worth embracing, regardless of the consequences. The battle with the purest faction lasted 6 hours and ended with Queen Seraphina standing over the surrendered leader of the rebellion, her formal gown somehow unstained despite the violence, while Marcus discovered that his dormant vampire genetics apparently included enhanced reflexes and an alarming aptitude for combat tactics he'd never learned. Lord Malachar, Queen Seraphina said to the defeated purist leader, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who'd ruled for centuries and dealt with countless challenges to her power. Your objection to my choice of consort has been noted and rejected. Do you yield, or shall we continue this discussion through more traditional means? Lord Malachar, ancient even by vampire standards, glared at Marcus with eyes that held millennia of accumulated disdain. You would bind our bloodline to a mortal. Dilute our heritage for the sake of political alliance. I would choose love over isolation, Queen Seraphina replied simply. And as recent events have demonstrated, Captain Kane is considerably more than a mere mortal. The genetic awakening triggered by the battle had been impossible to ignore. Marcus had moved with speed and precision that defied human limitations, his tactical awareness enhanced to levels that allowed him to coordinate vampire and human forces with intuitive effectiveness. Dr. Kim's monitoring equipment had recorded physiological changes that shouldn't have been possible, enhanced strength, improved reaction times, and most significantly, the beginning of cellular regeneration patterns typical of vampire biology. The prophecies spoke of this, Lord Bartholomew announced with obvious satisfaction as he reviewed the battle's aftermath. The return of the hybrid bloodlines, the joining of mortal passion and immortal wisdom. Though I confess, I expected it to be more ceremonial and less explosively violent. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of processing both political revolution and personal transformation simultaneously. So what exactly am I becoming? Dr. Kim consulted her readings with the excitement of someone documenting a scientific breakthrough. Based on these cellular changes, you're developing enhanced vampire characteristics while retaining human emotional patterns and aging processes. Essentially, you're becoming the first successful human-vampire hybrid in recorded history. Enhanced lifespan? Marcus asked, thinking of Queen Seraphina's earlier comments about the pain of watching mortal partners age and die. Significantly enhanced, Dr. Kim confirmed. Preliminary projections suggest several centuries, possibly longer if the transformation continues progressing. Queen Seraphina moved to Marcus's side, her expression combining relief at their victory with something deeper, hope tempered by the caution that came from centuries of disappointment. "The choice is yours," she said quietly. "I won't force this transformation upon you. If you prefer to remain fully human, we can halt the process now." Marcus studied her face, seeing past the regal composure to the vulnerability beneath. He thought about their conversations over the past weeks, the way she'd shared centuries of accumulated wisdom and loneliness, the gradual revelation that beneath her fearsome reputation lay someone who simply wanted to be known and loved for who she truly was. "What would it mean?" he asked. "For us, for our peoples, for whatever this relationship becomes?" "It would mean partnership," Queen Seraphina said simply. "Not just diplomatic alliance, but genuine cooperation between our species. It would mean that neither of us faces the future alone." Ambassador Collins, who had spent the battle coordinating between human and vampire forces while muttering about diplomatic protocols that didn't cover interspecies warfare, stepped forward with documents that looked suspiciously official. "If I may," he said with the careful dignity of someone whose career had survived multiple impossible situations, "I've prepared preliminary treaty frameworks based on the assumption that this engagement will proceed to formal marriage." "You prepared treaty frameworks?" Marcus asked with amusement. "It seemed prudent," Collins replied. "Particularly after watching you coordinate battle tactics with beings who've been waging war for millennia. Clearly, this relationship has implications beyond personal affection." The formal engagement ceremony took place 3 days later in the Crimson Eternum's Grand Ballroom, with representatives from both human and vampire governments in attendance. Marcus stood beside Queen Seraphina as ancient vows were spoken in languages that predated human civilization, while Dr. Kim monitored his continuing transformation with scientific fascination and Ambassador Collins managed diplomatic protocols with the skill of someone who'd learned to expect the impossible. "By blood and starlight," Queen Seraphina said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "I bind my life to yours, my strength to your courage, my immortal years to whatever time we're granted together." Marcus responded with words that felt both foreign and familiar, as though his awakening vampire heritage carried memory of ancient ceremonies. "By choice and destiny, I offer my mortal heart to your immortal soul, my brief flame to your eternal fire, my love to whatever we become together." The exchange of blood that sealed their bond was both ceremony and transformation. Marcus felt the last of his dormant genetics activate as Queen Seraphina's essence merged with his own, creating something new that was neither fully human nor completely vampire. "How do you feel?" Dr. Kim asked later, as they stood together on the observation deck watching the combined human and vampire fleets preparing for their return journey. "Different," Marcus admitted, flexing his hands and feeling strength that hadn't been there days before. "But still myself. Enhanced, maybe, but not replaced." Queen Seraphina joined them, moving with the fluid grace that had first captivated him but now feeling natural rather than alien. "The transformation will continue for several months," she explained. "But the essential changes are complete. You're now something unprecedented, a being who bridges our species while belonging fully to neither." "And belonging fully to both," Marcus corrected, taking her hand and feeling the electric connection that came from shared essence and chosen love. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the throne room of New Dracula, the vampire homeworld that had become their joint seat of power, listening to reports from human and vampire administrators working together to establish unprecedented cooperation between their peoples. The transformation was complete now. He looked barely different than before, but his enhanced senses could detect emotional undertones in conversations, his strength matched vampire standards, and his projected lifespan stretched across centuries rather than decades. "Any regrets?" Queen Seraphina asked as they reviewed proposals for joint research initiatives and cultural exchange programs. Marcus considered the question seriously, looking out at the sprawling city below where humans and vampires worked side by side in ways that would have been impossible just months before. "Only one," he said finally. "Oh." Queen Seraphina raised an eyebrow with the expression of someone prepared to address whatever concern her consort might have. I regret that it took me 35 years to accidentally propose to the right person, Marcus replied with a grin that made her laugh, a sound like silver bells that still made his enhanced heart race. Your timing was perfect, she assured him, moving to stand beside him at the massive window. Any earlier, and neither of us would have been ready for what we've become. Below them, the city hummed with the energy of two species learning to build something new together. Human engineers worked alongside vampire architects to design buildings that accommodated both solar sensitivity and human lighting needs. Scientists from both races collaborated on research that was advancing medical understanding at unprecedented rates. Cultural exchange programs had produced art, music, and literature that neither species could have created alone. Lord Bartholomew still insists this was all prophetic destiny, Marcus observed, watching a group of vampire children play with human youngsters in a park designed to provide both shade and sunlight. Perhaps it was, Queen Seraphina said thoughtfully. Or perhaps destiny is simply what we call it when accidental courage leads to intentional love. Dr. Kim's voice came through their communication system with the enthusiasm that had become familiar over the months. Your Majesties, we've just received confirmation from the research teams. The hybrid genetics you both developed are stable and inheritable. Any children would represent a true merger of both species' best characteristics. Marcus and Queen Seraphina exchanged glances, both thinking of conversations they'd had about the future and the possibility of expanding their partnership beyond just the two of them. Children, Marcus mused. I suppose that's the next impossible thing we'll need to figure out how to manage. With our track record, Queen Seraphina replied, her crimson eyes sparkling with amusement and love, I suspect we'll accidentally stumble into parenthood with the same grace we brought to everything else. As the twin suns of New Dracula set beyond the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Marcus reflected on how a whispered joke had transformed into something that changed the course of galactic history. He'd meant to make a private comment about the absurdity of attraction. Instead, he'd answered a destiny he never knew he was seeking. Same time tomorrow, he asked, echoing the ritual question that had begun their evening conversations aboard the Crimson Eternum. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, Queen Seraphina replied, the words carrying the weight of a promise that would span centuries. Though I suspect our conversations will be considerably less diplomatic and much more focused on figuring out how to rule two species while raising hybrid children who will probably inherit both human stubbornness and vampire dramatic flair. Marcus laughed, pulling his immortal queen close as the stars emerged in the darkening sky. I can't wait to see what we accidentally accomplish next. In the distance, ships from both human and vampire worlds continued their peaceful approach to the planet that had become a symbol of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict, love over fear, and shared destiny over isolation. And in the throne room where it all began with a whispered proposal and an unhesitating, yes, two souls who had found each other across the vast darkness between worlds continued writing a love story that would be remembered long after the stars themselves had burned to ash.